The wind moved like something alive that night, howling, clawing, whispering secrets through the timberline. Inside her lonely hut, the girl pressed her back to the hearth, clutching her father's old rifle, counting the beats of the storm. Every sound beyond the walls was a ghost. Until one wasn't. Through the gale came a cry so faint it seemed born of the wind itself. Not a wolf, not the groan of wood or ice, but the thin, raw sound of a child in peril. For a heartbeat, she thought she imagined it. Then it came again, piercing, human, desperate. She stared into the storm, the rifle trembling in her hands. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, low and steady. "Mercy ain't weakness, Clara. It's courage wearing frost." Before she could think, she threw her coat around her shoulders and stepped into the blinding white, the door slamming shut behind her like a final breath of warmth. The snow blinded her. The lantern was nearly out, its flame clawing at the glass like a trapped soul. She stumbled through the drifts, following the faint, broken cries until her knees struck something half-buried. A shape small and still. Beneath a torn deerskin wrap lay a baby, no older than a year. Its face blue with cold, but alive. Eyes fluttering under a crust of ice. Around them, shadows moved. Low, silent, circling. Wolves. She felt them before she saw them, their yellow eyes glinting like embers in the dark. Her father's words roared again through the storm. "Don't run! Stand your ground, girl." Her hands shook as she raised the rifle, every nerve screaming. The baby whimpered and the nearest wolf growled, a deep, hungry note that rattled through her bones. The first wolf lunged, its snarl drowned by the wind. The rifle cracked like thunder, muzzle flash slicing the dark. Snow erupted, the pack scattering and circling again. Clara screamed, not from fear, but fury, and fired once more, the recoil slamming into her shoulder. The baby wailed, tiny arms twitching beneath the blanket. She dropped the rifle to snatch the child up, spinning as another shape lunged from her flank. The wolf's teeth caught her sleeve, dragging her down into the snow. She kicked, shoved, struck with her fist until the beast fell away, blood on the snow and fire in her lungs. For a long heartbeat, there was only wind. And then silence. Her breath came ragged, throat raw from the cold. She stared at the motionless wolves, at the steaming dark stains spreading on the snow. The child whimpered weakly, and she gathered him close against her chest, tucking his frozen hands into her coat. The storm raged harder, swallowing sound and horizon alike. She looked back toward where her cabin should have been, but all she saw was white emptiness. The lantern had gone out. She was lost. The world erased in frost and wind, and yet her arms held warmth. She pressed her cheek to the baby's brow, whispering through chattering teeth, "You ain't dying out here." Not tonight. By the time she stumbled through her cabin door, dawn was still a dream buried beneath the blizzard. She collapsed beside the hearth, arms numb and trembling, as she tore off her coat and pressed the child close to the fire's glow. His breath was shallow, barely visible. She rubbed his hands, his feet, whispering to him, pleading with the silence to give him back. Slowly, the faintest cry escaped his lips, a sound like a match catching flame. Tears broke loose down her cheeks. She smiled through them, shaking her head in disbelief. "You stubborn little thing," she whispered. "You want to live." Outside, the storm raged, but inside, for the first time in 2 winters, she was not alone. Morning broke slow and pale, the kind that never quite remembers what warmth feels like. The storm had passed, leaving silence so deep it pressed against her chest. The baby lay wrapped beside the hearth, skin no longer blue, but flushed faintly pink. She watched him, still afraid to breathe too loud, afraid he'd vanish back into the snow that birthed him. Hunger gnawed her ribs. The last of the cornmeal was gone, and the trapline hung empty. She thought of the wolves she'd killed, of the circle of tracks out there in the white. She knew what those tracks meant, that somewhere beyond the ridge, people would be looking for their child. Her fingers brushed the tiny beads sewn into his wrap. Her father's voice echoed again. "Mercy has its price, Clara. You pay it with your whole heart." By noon, the sky had turned the color of steel, and the forest moaned under the weight of ice. She bundled the child tight and stepped outside to check the traps. The snow reached her thighs now, each step a small wall. The traps were empty, the creek frozen solid. She lifted her face to the wind, half praying, half cursing the land that refused her mercy. Somewhere far off, a raven cried, a long, lonely sound that carried across the valley. She glanced down at the sleeping infant in her arms, then toward the ridgeline where the cry had come from. Something inside her knew. This was not over. She built a stew from melted snow, dried roots, and the smallest scrap of venison she'd been saving. It barely flavored the water, but the scent filled the room with something that felt almost like comfort. The baby stirred, soft noises bubbling from his throat. She smiled without meaning to, spooning the weak broth into a rag and letting drops fall against his lips. He swallowed, coughed once, then settled. The smallest sound escaped her, a laugh so fragile she startled herself. It had been years since she'd heard her own laughter. Night came early, as it always did. She sat awake long after the fire had turned to coals, listening. The forest was too quiet. No owls, no wolves, no wind. Only the faint creak of the roof under its snow load. She thought of her parents' graves somewhere out there beneath the drifts, of the promise she'd made when she buried them. Survive, no matter what. But as she looked down at the child, she felt a new kind of promise take root. A wordless vow that survival wasn't enough anymore. Something stirred in the distance, soft but deliberate. The hair at the back of her neck rose. It was almost dawn when she saw it. The mark in the snow just beyond her window. Not animal, not wind. A boot print. Then, another. Her heart turned to ice. She rose slowly, clutching the baby close, the rifle cold in her grip. Outside, the horizon burned faint red with sunrise, painting long shadows that led down from the ridge. She knew then she was no longer alone. Whether salvation or reckoning was coming, and it was coming for the child she'd sworn to save. When morning fully broke, the valley felt wrong. Still. Heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Clara stepped outside, the baby tied close to her chest, the rifle across her shoulder. The snow glittered under a pale sun, but every glint felt like an eye. Then she saw them, tracks half buried but unmistakable. Horses, more than a few. She knelt, tracing the print with her bare fingers. Not settlers, not trappers. The hoof marks were smooth-shod and narrow. War ponies. Her breath hitched. She turned toward the tree line, where smoke rose faintly between the pines. Somewhere out there, men were moving. She backed toward her door, the baby stirring, his small hand clutching at her shirt. She whispered, "They're coming for you, little one, and maybe for me too." She spent the day shuttering the windows, stacking what firewood she had left against the door. Her hands moved quick, but her mind was far away, back to when her father used to say that fear could be shaped like a tool if you held it right. She felt it shaping her now, sharpening her thoughts. The baby cried once softly, and she hushed him against her heartbeat. Outside, the forest cracked and whispered. She thought of leaving, of running south toward the frozen creek, but the snow was too deep, and she was too weak. So she waited, listening to the wind that now carried something beneath it. Voices, faint and rhythmic, like drums without drums. That night, sleep never came. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint smell of smoke and leather and horses. She rose and peered through a slit in the boards. Nothing but shadows. Then a sound drifted through the stillness. A woman's voice calling out in a language she didn't know, soft and low, carried on the wind. The child stirred in his cradle, responding with a faint whimper, as if he knew the sound. Clara's breath caught. Whoever was out there wasn't hunting her. They were searching. Still, she didn't open the door. She sat back by the fire, clutching her father's rifle, torn between mercy and terror. Before dawn, she awoke to a sharp sound. A horse's snort. Close, too close. Her pulse leapt. She crawled to the window and pulled one board aside just enough to see. Through the thinning mist stood a figure astride a paint horse, wrapped in fur and feathers, the spear in his hand tipped with black obsidian that caught the early light. His face was painted red and white, motionless as carved stone. He turned his head, scanning the forest, and she froze, breath locked in her throat. The child murmured, and she pressed him tight to her chest. The warrior's gaze flicked toward the cabin, lingering. Then he rode off slowly, disappearing into the tree line. She didn't move for a long time after he was gone. By nightfall, the valley was alive again, with motion, with whispers, with the thrum of hooves muffled by snow. She stood by the hearth, rifle ready, every muscle trembling. The baby slept, warm and unaware, his tiny chest rising and falling. Outside, faint torchlight flickered through the trees like fireflies. 2 shadows passed by her window, then 5, then more. She realized the truth like a knife sliding between her ribs. It wasn't just a few riders. It was an army. They had found her. And come dawn, she would have to face them. The first light of dawn crept slow across the frozen land, pale and trembling as if afraid to touch what waited below. Clara stood at the window, eyes hollow, heart pounding a rhythm older than fear itself. The valley was filled with riders, hundreds of them. Their horses moved in silence, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold. Spears and bows glinted faintly in the light, feathers stirring like ghosts. Clara's breath fogged a glass as she whispered to herself, "So this is it." The baby stirred in her arms, soft and warm against her. She held him tighter, her pulse steadying. "You're not alone, little one," she murmured. "Not while I can still stand." Outside, the warriors formed a circle around her hut, and the world went perfectly still. They didn't rush her, didn't shout, or raise their weapons. The silence was worse than any war cry could have been. One rider broke from the circle and approached slowly, his horse's breath a cloud in the morning air. He dismounted with calm precision, his movements deliberate and grave. Clara's hands shook on the rifle, though she didn't raise it. The man stood tall, unarmed, his eyes steady as he looked at her. Eyes that spoke not of rage, but of something deeper, older. Between them stretched the still air, brittle and fragile as ice. The chief lifted a hand, slowly, open-palmed, and spoke a single word she couldn't understand. The tone, though, was clear. He was asking for the child. Her knees went weak. She looked down at the baby's sleeping face, his dark lashes trembling. Her throat burned as she whispered, "He is yours, ain't he?" The man's gaze didn't waver. Behind him, the warriors watched, still as statues. She took a step forward. The weight of the world pressed against her chest. "If you're gonna take him," she said softly, "do it gentle. He's been through hell enough." Before she could move, another figure rode forward. A woman this time. Her cry shattered the silence, a sound sharp and raw, cutting straight through Clara's heart. The rider dismounted before the horse had stopped moving, falling to her knees in the snow. Clara froze, staring as the woman crawled toward them, tears streaking paint from her cheeks. When their eyes met, Clara saw it. The same terror, the same love. The woman reached out, voice breaking, calling a name she didn't know. The baby stirred, then let out a soft cry in answer. The world seemed to stop. The woman, his mother, it had to be, rose slowly. Eyes locked on Clara's. No anger, no hatred now, only something fragile and aching. Clara stepped forward and placed the baby gently in her arms. The woman cradled him, whispering words that trembled with relief. The chief lowered his head and a ripple passed through the circle of warriors. No one spoke, yet the air felt full of voices, of ancestors, of forgiveness, of all the blood that had ever been spilled on this land. Clara swayed, exhaustion finally breaking through. As her knees buckled, strong hands caught her before she fell. They led her through the snowbound valley in silence. No ropes, no weapons drawn, just the steady rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind across the drifts. The warriors rode around her in a great, unbroken circle as she walked beside the chief's horse, clutching the blanket they'd given her. The baby, little Elk, was gone now, safe in his mother's arms, but his warmth still lingered against her chest like a heartbeat she could not let go. When they reached the camp, smoke rose from dozens of fires, painting the air with the scent of pine and hide. Faces turned as she passed, some curious, some hard, some sorrowful. She didn't know if she was walking toward mercy or her own end. They brought her before a great fire at the center of the camp. The people gathered in a wide ring, their faces flickering between light and shadow. The chief stood beside her, speaking words she couldn't understand, his voice calm but heavy. A smaller figure stepped forward, little Elk's mother. She carried the baby in her arms, his eyes open now, calm and bright. The woman's gaze burned into Clara's, filled with something fierce and unspoken. Then she spoke, her voice breaking once, and lifted the child toward the flames as if to let the spirits see him. The crowd murmured softly. Clara felt the world narrow to that single glowing circle of fire and breath. The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the black sky. Ren's voice rose in a chant, trembling but strong. Clara didn't understand the words, yet somehow she knew their meaning. Forgiveness, gratitude, the weight of blood given back to the earth. Then, without warning, Ren turned to her and stepped close. The crowd hushed. The woman's eyes were wet as she spoke, and this time the meaning came not from the sound but from the heart, her voice breaking as she whispered one word. Sister. The word struck deeper than any blade. Clara's throat closed. Tears froze on her lashes as the crowd began to murmur again. Softer this time, almost like a song. The chief stepped forward. Then, his eyes glinting with firelight, he spoke slowly, his deep voice echoing through the cold air. Though she couldn't understand his words, the tone told her everything. Judgment, respect, and something that sounded like sorrow. When he finished, he held out a small object, a feather black as midnight, bound in red thread. He placed it in her hands, closing her fingers around it. For a moment, the two simply stood there, two worlds bound by one act of mercy. The crowd bowed their heads, the flames sighing as if in approval. When it was done, the people began to disperse, their voices low and soft. Clara stood by the dying fire, the feather clutched to her chest. The chief nodded once, his face unreadable, and turned away. Ren approached, her steps slow, and placed the baby gently in Clara's arms once more. For tonight, she said, her accent rough but clear. He sleep warm, with you. Clara blinked in disbelief, her heart pounding. She looked down at little Elk's small face, his lashes fluttering, and knew this night would change everything. Somewhere deep in the valley, a wolf howled, a long, low song that sounded almost like peace. That night, the campfire burned low, its glow a heartbeat in the dark. Clara sat among the tribe, a quiet stranger at the edge of a great circle of warmth. The cold air shimmered with smoke and song, voices rising softly in their native tongue, stories older than memory itself. The baby slept against her chest, his tiny breath steady and sure. Ren sat across from her, face half lit by flame, eyes following her with quiet study. Clara felt the old ache of hunger, fear, loneliness. But for the first time, none of it owned her. The fire cracked, and someone began to drum, slow and low. The sound reached down into her bones, pulling something ancient and wordless to the surface. She didn't understand their language, yet somehow she understood every word. When the song ended, Ren rose, the fire painting her in gold and crimson. She crossed the circle and knelt before Clara, holding out a carved wooden bowl filled with steaming broth. The scent of sage and venison filled the air. Clara hesitated, unsure if it was meant for her, until Ren nodded. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, and for a heartbeat, the world felt still. Clara took a slow sip, warmth spreading through her chest like sunlight. After years of winter around them, the tribe fell silent, watching not as judges but as witnesses to something sacred, the giving of life from one world to another. Later, as the flames dwindled, Chief Running Horse spoke. His words rolled slow and deep, each syllable carrying the weight of mountains. Though Clara couldn't grasp the language, his meaning found her. He spoke of the past, the blood spilled, the wrongs buried beneath snow, and of a new fire meant to burn away old shadows. He looked at her as he spoke, his eyes heavy with both grief and hope. Then he drew a circle in the dirt between them and placed a coal from the fire inside it. Clara watched as the coal glowed brighter, as if answering a prayer. Ren reached into her own hair and untied a single blue bead, polished smooth by time. She held it up to the firelight before pressing it into Clara's palm. "You keep," she said softly, her voice accented but sure. "For his spirit? For you." Clara stared at it, the color of mountain sky after rain, and felt tears rise unbidden. She had no words, only the small, trembling nod of someone who has been given back her faith. Ren smiled faintly, then brushed a lock of red hair from Clara's face before turning away into the glow of the fire. As the night deepened, Clara sat watching the fire's last coals fade into ash. The stars above seemed sharper now, closer. The child stirred, reaching out a tiny hand that brushed against her chin before settling again. She smiled, weary but unbroken. Somewhere nearby, Ren hummed a lullaby in her tongue, and for the first time in years, Clara felt truly safe. She glanced toward the chief's tent, where shadows moved softly within, and knew that tomorrow would bring a choice. But for this one night, beneath the covenant of fire, the world was at peace. When dawn came, it came soft and silver, spilling across the valley like breath upon glass. The camp still slept, fires burned low, and a pale mist clung to the earth. Clara woke to the sound of horses snorting, the smell of smoke and pine, the warmth of the baby still pressed to her heart. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she saw the bead in her palm, blue as morning sky, and the truth returned. She rose quietly, stepping into the open air. The world was hushed, almost holy. Every direction was unknown, every path dangerous, yet her fear was gone. She wasn't the girl who hid from the storm anymore. She was the one who walked into it. She found the chief waiting by the river, the sun caught in his hair like fire through smoke. He stood unmoving, gazing across the thawing water where the ice broke and drifted downstream. When she approached, he turned. No words, only the solemn weight of understanding between them. He pointed toward the southern ridge, where the land dipped into endless pine. Then, to the east, where the tribe's horses waited. She knew what he was asking. Stay or go. The decision rested not on survival anymore, but on belonging. The tribe gathered quietly to watch. Ren stood among them, little Elk now in her arms once more, his eyes bright in the morning light. She met Clara's gaze and nodded. Not as rivals, not even as strangers, but as two women bound by something deeper than blood. The chief raised his hand in farewell, his expression proud, sorrowful, and full of grace. Clara swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the blue bead at her neck. She wanted to speak, but found no words strong enough. So she bowed her head, the gesture trembling but true. She mounted one of their horses, a dappled gray mare with a scar along her flank. The chief had given it to her without a word, the reins braided with red thread. As she rode from the camp, the tribe stood silent, watching. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She turned once in the saddle. Wren lifted little Elk high in the air, the baby's laughter ringing out clear and bright. The sound struck Clara like sunlight after rain. She smiled, a small, tired, grateful smile, and rode on. By the time the sun climbed high, she had reached the edge of the forest. She stopped and looked back one last time. Smoke from the tribe's camp curled upward, thin and pale, vanishing into the blue. The mountains stood behind it all, endless and eternal. Clara touched the bead at her throat, whispering to the wind, "Thank you." Then she turned south. Her path opened before her, the hoofbeats steady beneath her like a heartbeat reborn. Behind her, a legend began. The story of a girl who faced the wolves, who bridged the distance between blood and mercy, and who carried the echo of dawn wherever she went.